love the channel and find it useful in becoming a happy retiree. Subscribe today. Good morning. Welcome back to Money Matters here. Sunday morning. So good to be back to 2 hours here. We're live. Taking your calls and your questions. Maybe there's been a backlog because we haven't really been taking. We don't have to, it's a 1 hour show, you don't have a lot of time. You don't have a lot of time to take calls and talk about the world that we live in. And we've been talking about taxes, and we've got this giant tax reform bill that looks like it's going to happen this week. And last week we did up, down, flat. And we did take calls last week to try to help you figure out whether your taxes were going to go up or down. What happened this past week is, and I would say this is the biggest development and biggest compromise we saw in this past 5 days, really had to do with lowering the top rate. So there's been a big misnomer that the taxes are only for the wealthy. And I think it's because in the very beginning, originally, the original bullet points for the tax bill were, hey, 35% top rate. Well, Congress didn't said that, no, that's a non-starter. And the House said, no, we're still sticking with 39.6. The Senate said 38.5. And what that did is that, and again, I ran dozens and dozens and dozens of different tax calculations, and we took lots of calls from you. And from what I could tell, from the most updated versions of the Trump or GOP tax calculator, is that for the vast majority of Americans, their taxes are going down, particularly in the middle class. You're making 75 grand, your taxes are going down. The only place I saw taxes going up were if you were making $250, $400, $500, $1 million a year. Yeah, under the tax plan that we had last Sunday, your taxes were actually going up a little bit for the most part, particularly if you're in a high income tax state because you're losing your SALT deduction, state and local income tax deduction going away. This week, they changed the top bracket as they compromise between the two plans. And now it looks as though you're going to get a top bracket of 37%. 37. So now you're going from 39.6 down to 37. Now the folks that were in those upper brackets that were getting a fairly sizable tax increase, from what I could tell from the bill of over a week ago, now actually will get a slight tax decrease. So now, from what I can tell, is this thing is expanded pretty significantly to providing tax cuts for the vast majority of folks. The vast majority of you are listening are getting a tax cut. And that's going to help economic growth for the next several years, potentially. Now, according to economists that are surveyed, that doesn't seem to be the case. We're going to talk about what I think is a study that's completely wrong. Let's talk about taxes. Despite the dire warnings that tax reform won't help the economy, history is pretty clear on the topic. Tax cuts stimulate economic growth. I don't know why there's a debate with this. And I find it hard to believe that injecting $100 billion of stimulus to GDP, and that's just next year, growth, year one, I find that hard to believe that won't lead to economic growth or more economic growth or an uptick. Let's talk about taxes. There is a ton of talk about how bad this tax bill is. It's going to raise the deficit. Now, nobody wants the deficit to go up. I get that. I don't want the deficit to go up. And then the fact that this bill could sunset in 2027 and it's going to go back to the way it used to be. I find that hard to believe. I find it hard to believe that we won't get these to eventually become permanent. But again, raising taxes after 2027 for everybody. And that, this will never stimulate the economy. Joe Stiglitz, a renowned economist, professor at Columbia, said it's the worst tax bill he's ever seen. It will never help the economy. On and on and on and on. Let's go into this. Let's talk about this was from Vox, Policy and Politics. Again, Vox is a great political resource. Widely believe the tax reform will not help the economy. Here's the headline, out of 42 economists, top economists, not just economists, but top economists, only one believes that the GOP tax bill will help the economy. And they asked all these economists, hey, do you think that GDP will be substantially higher a decade from now? Now, first of all, that's ridiculous from the outset. A decade, you can't go out a decade. The economists can't even figure out how to tie their shoes next week. And now you're asking them to tell me what's going to happen in a decade? Come on. Ridiculous to even ask that. But it is interesting the way that they answered this. Of 42 economists polled, only one thought that the bill would boost the economy. And most of them just said, look, there's no way this is going to help. A couple comments. Of course not, wrote University of Chicago's Austin Goolsby. Does anyone care about actual evidence anymore, he says. Oh, well, we're going to get to some evidence. A number of economists argue that the tax policy isn't a really powerful lever that Republicans want to believe. Okay. MIT's David Autor, I don't know how to pronounce the last name. He's a trade economist, said doubt it will substantially change things either way. No help. Okay. Another comment here. Aside from the redistribution of wealth, hard to see this changing much. This is from Richard Thaler. He just won the Nobel Prize in economics. So you get some heavy hitters in here. There was one guy, so 1 out of 42, said that it might spur the economy over the long run. But he also said the one guy that said it could help said it wasn't fair. Said whether the overall tax plan is redistributionally fair or distributionally fair is another matter. So pretty remarkable. But here's what's interesting. The same thing happened back in 2003. The same exact fodder, if you remember. The tax cuts aren't going to do anything. The CBO, and everyone puts all this stock of what the CBO says. The Congressional Budget Office. They're the ones that score this stuff. They say, okay, we're gonna lose this in tax revenue, but then economic growth could go up or down or sideways, and then that change could impact more or less tax revenue. So they're trying to score this. They're trying to figure out what will happen in the future with all these changes. How's it going to impact the economy? Well, back in 2003, they underestimated the impact of the tax cuts in 2003, the 3 years following the 2003 tax cuts, by $1 trillion. They missed it by $1 trillion. So you miss growth. Missing a growth estimate by $1 trillion, that's not a rounding error. That was a major, major whiff. So the 2003 tax cuts, if you go back and look at really what they amounted to, they were about $350 billion over 5 years and led to, okay, what is that? How does that translate to today? Well, that's only about 25% of the size of what we're probably going to see here in this tax bill. And back in 2003, look at what happened in 2004 and 2005 and 2006. It led to a huge jump in economic activity. We went from under 2% GDP growth in 2002 and 2003 to between 3 and 4% in 2005. I'm sorry, in 2004 and 2005 and 2006. Let me say that again. We went from under 2% GDP growth to almost a 4% or between a 3 and a 4% rate in 2004, in 2005, and 2006. So we virtually doubled the rate of GDP growth after that tax cut. We've talked about also how we could potentially, how this thing gets paid for. Very legitimate question, very legitimate concern. Well, if you're going to cut taxes by $1.5 trillion, isn't that just going to crush the deficit? Well, it would if the economy doesn't perk up. But right now, the CBO score on where the economy is going to be next year and over the next several years is about 1.8% real GDP growth. If we go to 2.5%, we end up making up for all that lost tax revenue because you've got higher economic growth, brings in more tax receipts to the Treasury. If we get to 3.5% growth, we actually create an extra $1.5 trillion in extra tax revenue. So not only do we make up for the 1.5 that we spent or lost technically we now have an additional, we make up for that, and then plus an additional $1.5 trillion in extra tax revenue. So $100 billion in cuts in 2018. And my research folks in DC and New York see at least another 1% in growth next year, if not 2%. Going from 2 to 3%, or where we are today, to around 3 to 4% will make a very big economic impact, a big impact on growth. I find it hard, again, so you're economists, you're economists, you're thinking about this, hey, it's never going to help the economy, on and on and on. I don't know if I'd overthink this. Next year, this tax bill is going to drop almost $100 billion into the consumer's pocket. Well, if you really break it out on who's going to get what between you and companies, you and me versus companies, the consumer is going to get about $85 billion in a net tax decrease. So that's $85 billion extra in your pocket. That's just next year, provided it passes next week, which I think it will. And corporations are going to get about $30 billion. So that's over $100 billion. It's going to just get dropped into the pockets of you and companies versus the IRS. And that's not going to be good for the economy. I find that hard to believe. Again, you do the math on what kind of economic growth uptick we need to pay for the tax cuts, you get to 3.5, and we more than double make up for the lost tax revenue. So despite 40 out of 42 economists who all hate the tax cut issue, so I find it hard to believe that there is not some major bias in all this. Saying that it's not going to spur economic growth over the long term, I think that that's a very biased look from this group, and I think they're very likely just wrong. It's almost impossible for them or anyone to look out over 10 years. So first of all, they should answer this survey and this question by saying, we have no idea what's going to happen in 10 years. But I can tell you over the next year or 2 or 3 years, I find it very hard to believe that $100 billion in stimulus I find it hard to believe that's not going to boost growth. Beware of 41 out of 42 economists. Anytime there's a consensus out of a group like that, really, you got to be careful. You got to be careful what you're looking at. Oh yeah, here's the estimate. So individual versus corporate next year, it looks as though. So let's review the actual data. That's consumer tax relief in 2018. The consumer side's going to be $88 billion. The corporate side, $27 billion. Those are the numbers back into everyone's pockets. I'm looking at some numbers here. 2003 tax cuts. In 2002, gross GDP growth, annual real growth, less than 1%. In 2003, it was less than 2%, 1.98. Then in 2004, after the tax cut, post-tax cut, GDP doubled to over 4%, real GDP. So this is accounting for inflation. Then in 2005, 3.4%. In 2006, 3.1%. So we went from less than 2 to high 3s, low 4s after the tax cut. So the fact that economists are saying this isn't going to help, it's not going to spur economic growth, again, I just don't know where they're getting that, or if they just don't like the idea of the tax bill. There's just a lot of bias out there, and I'm trying to clean that up for you as an investor.
Hi, I'm Wes Moss, and thanks for taking a minute to hear about what's so different about my new book, You Can Retire Sooner Than You Think. So unlike other retirement books, this book will give you a step-by-step guide, whether you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s, to learn from what these successful and happy retirees did to get there. I hope you enjoy the book, but more importantly, I know that it'll help you retire sooner than you think.